Somewhere between sleep and waking, the hands were waiting. They curled around the railings, pale fingers pressing through the rusted iron, stretching toward him. Small hands, too small. The kind that should have been holding a skipping rope, a toy, a parent's reassuring grip. But here they only reached for him, desperate, cold, pleading. A wind howled across the bridge, and the world around him blurred, shifting from dream to nightmare. The smell of damp wood and iron filled his lungs. His pulse thundered in his ears. He could hear the train coming, the rhythmic thud of its weight on the old tracks growing louder, faster, closer. Then came the screams, 3 voices, thin and shrill, not words, just terror. And then, impact. A sickening, wet, tearing sound. Blood. It sprayed across the old stone of the bridge, streaking the railings, pooling in the cracks of the worn timber sleepers. A mangled limb twisted unnaturally near the edge. The hands were gone now, swallowed by the violent rush of the train, but their presence remained. Edwin Holloway gasped awake. He sat bolt upright, drenched in sweat, his breath ragged. The dream had been so real, more vivid than it had ever been before. He knew that place, the bridge, the tracks, the smell of damp iron and death. And yet, he had never been there in his life. For 38 years he had suffered these dreams, since childhood, always the same, the hands, the screams, the blood. He had stopped telling people about them long ago. His mother had once brushed them off as just bad dreams. A doctor had suggested they were a manifestation of anxiety. But deep down, Edwin knew better. It was more than a nightmare. It was a memory of something he had never lived. Ravenscar. Ravenscar, North Yorkshire. Present day. The wind off the sea carried a bite, rolling over the moors and whipping against the stone buildings of Ravenscar. Edwin pulled his coat tighter as he walked through the village, passing the old slate-roofed cottages and the lonely remains of railway tracks that led nowhere. Ravenscar was a strange place. Once intended to be a thriving Victorian seaside resort, it had never quite happened. The hotels had never been built. The grand train station had been abandoned. Time had forgotten this place, and in its quiet neglect, it had become something else, a village full of ghosts. He had come here for work, a feature on rural communities and their fading traditions for a mid-tier publication. Nothing to do with ghost stories or childhood nightmares, and yet something about Ravenscar had stirred something in him the moment he arrived. The landscape was too familiar, the air smelled like iron, and tonight, as he sat in the Black Hart, the village's only pub, he heard something that made his stomach drop. A group of older men sat near the fire, drinking pints, speaking in low, quiet voices. The kind of conversation meant only for those who already knew the story. The hands, one muttered. People still see them. Edwin stiffened. Another man shook his head, his voice hoarse. That bridge should have been torn down, but they left it. And people still talk, still say they feel something when they cross it. Edwin's pint sat untouched in front of him. His fingers tightened around the glass. A third man exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Load of old nonsense, if you ask me. That story's been around for 100 bloody years. Nothing ever proven. Proven? The first man scoffed. What's to prove? 3 kids were killed on that bridge. Everyone knows the story. Edwin felt his heartbeat pound against his ribs. 3 children, the same number as in his dreams. The legend. He listened, motionless, as the men recounted the village's oldest ghost story. It had happened over a century ago, in the Victorian era. 3 children, 2 boys, 1 girl, had been playing near the old railway bridge. The train had come too fast. They hadn't made it off the tracks in time. The steam engine had crushed them, their bodies smeared across the bridge, leaving a horrific scene that scarred Ravenscar forever. Ever since people had spoken of hands reaching through the railings, ghostly fingers curling over the edges of the bridge. Some believed they were trying to save people from the same fate. Others whispered that they were trying to drag the living down with them. "They say you can feel it," the first man murmured. "If you walk across that bridge at night, you can feel them. Cold hands brushing your skin." The other man scoffed. Nonsense. But Edwin knew the story wasn't nonsense because he had dreamed of it his entire life. Something didn't add up. As the men continued talking, Edwin picked up something strange. Their versions of the story didn't match. One said the children had been playing a game when the train came. Another claimed they had been chasing a lost dog onto the tracks. One even suggested they had been running away from something. And then there was the strangest part, the way they spoke about the deaths. The usual tone of a ghost story is fear, a bit of dark fascination, but this sounded like guilt, like a story that had been told to hide something else. Edwin had spent years writing investigative pieces. He knew when people were hiding something. And as he sat there listening to the whispers of the past, he realized something that chilled him to the bone. The ghost story of the hands wasn't the real mystery. The real mystery was what had actually happened to those children before they were laid on the tracks. And worse, someone in Ravenscar still knew the truth.
Edwin woke to silence. It pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He could hear nothing but the erratic thump of his own heart. He sat up in bed, the events of the previous day replaying in his mind like a macabre film on repeat. He had arrived in Ravenscar yesterday, a picturesque village nestled amidst the ominous moors. He was here to investigate the deaths of 3 children, their lifeless bodies found by the riverbank, their deaths shrouded in an unsettling mystery. The old man at the inn had warned him. Some things, he'd rasped, his voice a chilling whisper, are best left buried. Edwin had dismissed it then, attributing the old man's words to local superstition. Now, as he sat in the oppressive silence of his room, his words echoed in the stillness, tinged with an unsettling premonition. He couldn't shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong in Ravenscar. The village, despite its idyllic facade, seemed to be hiding a dark and sinister secret. Edwin rose from his bed and walked to the window. The morning mist clung to the village, shrouding everything in an ethereal, almost ghostly light. Ravenscar was as quiet as a graveyard. The villagers, he had noticed, were a reticent lot, their faces etched with a strange mix of fear and suspicion. Their silence was unnerving, their eyes following his every move with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. He had a feeling that they knew more than they let on, that they were all players in a sinister play, their roles carefully rehearsed, their lines delivered with practiced ease. He looked out at the river, its surface shimmering under the pale morning light. The river, they said, held secrets, secrets that whispered on the wind, secrets that haunted the dreams of the villagers, secrets that Edwin was determined to uncover. His first lead was the Ravenscar Local History Society. He found the building tucked away in a quiet corner, its stone facade covered in creeping ivy. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and decay, the silence broken only by the ticking of an old grandfather clock. A woman sat behind a desk, her face half hidden behind a mountain of ancient-looking books. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice as brittle as dried leaves. "Edwin Davenport," he introduced himself. "I'm here about the children and the history of Ravenscar." The woman, Mrs. Merton, her name tag proclaimed, stiffened. "The children?" she echoed, her eyes narrowing. "A terrible tragedy. But what's that got to do with history?" "I'm interested in any unusual events, any local legends," Edwin pressed. Mrs. Merton hesitated, her gaze flickering towards a particular shelf. "Ravenscar has its share of stories," she said finally, her voice a low murmur. "But they're just stories, nothing more." She pointed him towards a collection of local folklore. As Edwin browsed through the dusty tomes, he couldn't shake off the feeling that Mrs. Merton was hiding something. Her reluctance to speak, her guarded demeanor, suggested a fear, a deep-seated unease that ran deeper than concern for a stranger's curiosity. He had a feeling that beneath the surface of her carefully constructed facade, Mrs. Merton knew more than she was letting on. His next stop was the village square. The war memorial stood there, a silent sentinel against the backdrop of the bleak moors. As he ran his fingers over the engraved names, a chilling detail struck him. An entire generation seemed to be missing, their names conspicuously absent from the cold stone. It was as if a whole generation had simply vanished, their existence erased from the annals of Ravenscar. Edwin's mind raced. Could this be connected to the children's deaths? Was there a link between the missing generation and the secrets that clung to Ravenscar like a shroud? He knew that to understand the present, he had to delve into the past. He had to unearth the secrets that Ravenscar had tried so hard to bury. As dusk crept in, casting long, ominous shadows across the village, Edwin found himself at the Black Hart, the only pub in Ravenscar. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the clinking of glasses and the hushed whispers of the locals. Their eyes followed his every move, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He ordered a pint of ale and tried to blend in, but it was no use. He was an outsider in a village that guarded its secrets closely. As he sat there, nursing his drink, a voice startled him. "You're asking too many questions, stranger," the voice hissed. Edwin turned to find himself face to face with a woman, her face shrouded in shadow. Her eyes, however, burned with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. "Some things," she warned, her voice barely a whisper, "are best left undisturbed." Before Edwin could respond, she melted back into the shadows, leaving him with a sense of foreboding that settled over him like a shroud. He realized then that he was treading on dangerous ground. The villagers knew why he was here, and they were watching his every move. That night, Edwin's sleep was plagued by nightmares. He dreamt of children by the river, their laughter echoing through the mist, their eyes wide with terror. He dreamt of the missing generation, their faces blurred, their voices calling out to him from the grave. And then he heard it, a name whispered on the wind, a name that sent shivers down his spine. The name echoed in the silence of his room as he woke with a start, his heart pounding. It was a name that someone in Ravenscar had tried to erase, a name buried deep in the village's dark past. And Edwin knew with a chilling certainty that this name held the key to unlocking the secrets.
Edwin woke with the name still burning in his mind, William Harcroft. It had come from the dream, the whispering voices of the children, the name uttered through the thick fog, through the choking, gasping breath of something unseen. And yet, as much as he racked his brain, he had never heard that name before, which meant only one thing: someone had erased it. By mid-morning, Edwin was back in the local History Society office. Mrs. Merton eyed him warily as he stepped inside, but he had come prepared this time. No hesitation, no small talk. "Edwin, I need to find records on the Harcroft family." She went still. Her fingers, which had been absently flipping through a catalog, froze on the page. A second too late, she said, "Mrs. Merton, no such family ever lived here. Lie. Edwin, you sure about that?" Mrs. Merton. Positive. Another lie. Edwin. I found the name in an old reference. It must be in the records somewhere. Mrs. Merton, you won't find anything. And just like that, Edwin knew the truth. Harcroft wasn't just a forgotten name. It had been deliberately erased. As soon as he left the office, Edwin headed for the nearest library in the next town over. Somewhere beyond Ravenscar's careful silence, records might still exist. Hours passed. Page after page of census records, old land registries, property deeds. Then, finally, a breakthrough. A single mention of the name Harcroft in an 1891 property tax log. William Harcroft, Ravenscar Estate Holdings. His heart thumped in his chest. He dug deeper. Another reference. A court proceeding from 1892. He clicked on the file, fingers trembling. The document was brief, a listing of charges brought against William Harcroft of Ravenscar. The crime, indecency with minors. Edwin felt his stomach turn. This was it. This was why the village had buried the name. William Harcroft had been accused of abusing children. And then, just months later, 3 children had been found dead on the tracks. The details were frustratingly sparse. No trial notes, no final ruling, just the charge itself and a stamp indicating the case had been dismissed. Harcroft had been a wealthy landowner, a powerful man, and the case had vanished. The timing was too perfect. The children died just after the accusations were made public. Had the village protected him? Had he been cleared of the charges? Or had someone ensured the case never reached court? And worst of all, were those 3 children his victims? A sickness settled in Edwin's gut. This wasn't just a ghost story, this was a cover-up, a crime that had never been punished, and the village had let it happen. That evening, as Edwin returned to his rented cottage, he knew something had changed. The moment he stepped through the door, he felt it. A presence, not ghostly, not supernatural, something real. The air was wrong, the stillness too deep. Someone had been here. His desk, where he had left his notebook open, had been disturbed. His notes on Harcroft were missing. Edwin's pulse thundered. He wasn't alone. The floorboard near the window creaked. He turned, just in time to see a figure slipping out the door, disappearing into the night. Edwin barely slept. He sat awake, listening to the wind outside, knowing that whoever had broken in wanted him to stop. By morning, a message had been left for him, not in words, but in the dead crow nailed to the fence outside his cottage. Its wings spread, its beak slightly open, a silent, unmistakable warning. Leave Ravenscar, or end up like them.
The dead crow was still nailed to the fence when Edwin left his cottage the next morning. Its message was clear. Turn back, leave Ravenscar, forget the past. But if they thought fear would stop him, they were wrong. He wasn't leaving. Not until he knew the truth. Edwin spent the morning tracing what was left of the Harcroft family line. There weren't many of them left. The name had faded from Ravenscar, scrubbed from local records, lost to time. But there was one. A name, buried in the depths of an old property registry. Reginald Harcroft, still alive, still in Ravenscar, and Edwin had a feeling he knew exactly where to find him. The Harcroft estate had once been grand. Now it was rotting. The great house stood at the edge of the village, beyond the ruins of an old walled garden. The roof sagged, ivy clawed its way up the crumbling stone, and the windows stared like black, empty eyes. Edwin pushed open the rusted gate and stepped inside. Reginald Harcroft was waiting for him. "You shouldn't have come here. I know about William Harcroft," a slow exhale. "You were a boy when it happened, weren't you? You knew what he was, and you knew what he did." Mouth tightens. The children, they accused him, and then they ended up on the tracks. Silence. A whisper. "We had no choice. What do you mean?" Shakes head, lips tremble. "He was too powerful. The families knew, but they couldn't stop him, so they covered it up." "Dear, they were children, and you let them die?" Eyes flicker. "The train would have done the job, but they weren't dead when they were put on the tracks." "They were still alive." Nods slowly, barely. The train did what we couldn't. The weight of that word sank like a stone in Edwin's gut. This wasn't just one man's crime, it was the village's. The children had been tortured, broken, discarded onto the tracks, left to die, and the village had let it happen. 100 years of silence. 100 years of pretending it had only been an accident. Edwin's pulse thundered in his ears. He took a step back, the room spinning. He needed to get out. He needed to leave. Grabs Edwin's wrist. His grip was stronger than it should have been. Edwin looked down at the bony, claw-like fingers digging into his skin, and that's when he saw them. Beyond the window in the overgrown garden, the hands were waiting, small, pale, emerging through the iron railings. They weren't reaching for him. They were pointing straight at Reginald. Then, slowly, they turned toward Edwin. They wanted him to do something, and for the first time he knew exactly what it was.